quickly on to what you're actually here for. Now, the reason you're here is to see Dr. Steve Head, ecologist, invertebrate zoologist, taught at universities, UK and abroad, Oman, Jamaica, headed up large conservation charities. But his role today, in a sense, he's the founder member and chair of the Wildlife Gardening Forum, which is what he's going to talk about, all about wildlife gardening, to open our eyes to the astonishing biodiversity that's in our gardens, or can be in our gardens, and probably is there if we look hard enough. And he's going to talk about that and much, much more. So without further ado, hope all being well, hope Steve's still there. If I can hand over to you, Steve, away you go.
Well, hey, okay, I'm going to press share screen now, and hopefully this means you should see my first slide. Is that right? Can you see it?
That's right. Yep, that's fine.
Okay, good, good. Okay, so thank you, first of all, Mark and Gillian, for inviting me to do this. It certainly keeps me on my toes, and it keeps me away from the gin and tonic until at least an hour or so from now, which is probably a good thing. I'm very pleased to see that we have Anna Williams and Jan Miller, both of whom are advisors for the Wildlife Gardening Forum and colleagues from a long time ago. This does make me worry, though, that there may be some particularly difficult questions to answer at the end, so thank you in advance. I will say what I was hoping to do was to start off by saying a greeting in Welsh, but I decided that A, my Welsh accent is going to be embarrassing, and B, how on earth do I manage to blend David Frost with a Welsh accent? So I will merely say, hello, good evening, and welcome. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about wildlife gardening myths and realities, and let's see, we'll start off with a discussion about garden biodiversity. Now, this may be old hat to some of you, but I think even so, some of the figures I'll give you will be quite surprising. We'll then go on to why gardens are so rich in species, and then on to just a little bit about the organisation that I'm helping to run, and then the problems for garden biodiversity, which includes the bit about myths. So at the end of that, there'll be question time, and I do hope that some of you will be able to stay on a little bit and ask some questions. But I'm going to start off with something by way of an exercise. And the question I'm asking here, under the topic of how many species live in gardens, I'd like you, if you want to answer this question, unmute yourself so I can hear what you're saying. And just shout out the first thing that comes to your mind when you see the question. Name any species of animal.
1,000.
1,000.
A hedgehog.
10,000.
No, name any single species, not how many there are in gardens.
Oh, sorry.
Hedgehog, good, that we're off to a start. Any other species?
Frogs, toads.
Toads, that's an interesting one.
Earthworms.
Ah, earthworms. All right, well, we don't carry this exercise any longer. It's just that when I address a typical audience, and I have to say you guys are probably not a typical audience, I will get everything from lions, tigers, rats, mice, frogs occasionally, toads, yes, but it takes an awfully long time before anybody thinks to mention an earthworm or any other invertebrate. And going back here, the fact is that British gardens only have about 40 species of birds, 5 or 6 species of mammals, and frankly, you'd probably be better off without any of them, and a maximum of about 6 species of amphibians and reptiles. So really, there isn't that much in the vertebrate fauna in gardens. So why do we think gardens are important for wildlife? Well, I can't help but show you this quote from the great Charles Elton, who more or less was the granddaddy of ecology. Broadly speaking, the domestic habitats are in the direction of biological deserts, or at any rate, very unnatural surroundings. And you know, that's what people assumed was the case for years and years, that gardens were just boring and had nothing of any interest in them. So along then came Jennifer Owen, and she was working in Leicester with her garden, and she studied over a period of about 30 years the fauna within her very ordinary garden. And this is what it is. This is her garden. It was a detached house, slightly bigger garden than average, but you know, nothing special. And looking at it, it's just a garden. She specifically didn't try to garden for wildlife. She wanted to have as normal a garden as possible. And about the only concession she made was that she didn't use pesticides unless she absolutely had to. So she was trying to be very light on the pesticides. And then over this period, helped by a lot of colleagues who were specialists in different areas, she identified in this one garden over 400 species of plants, 360 Lepidoptera, 250 odd beetles, and just within the insects, a total of 2,204 species in 34 insect groups. But of course, there are an awful lot of groups that she couldn't look at. And so by looking at the proportions of the total number of British species that she did find within each group, and then projecting that across the groups that she couldn't study, she's got evidence for about 8,500 species of insects alone likely to be found in gardens if you look hard enough. And she looked very hard within some groups. The ichneumon wasps, for example, she found 3 species which were new to Britain in her garden, and she found 1 species which was new to science. So it is a bit of an indication, if you look hard in a habitat, what you'll find. And the truth is, garden biodiversity isn't in the vertebrates. It's in that very scientific term, the creepy-crawlies. So we've got a little run through. We've got the banded snail here, which is a pretty harmless species, actually, when it comes to eating things. Slugs, some slugs are horrible. This is one that's actually somewhat predatory, and others will only eat rotting vegetation. There's a web spider, there's a hunting spider, there's a leaf bug, a shield bug rather, a lacewing, which as you all know is very useful for controlling aphids. There's a cockchafer, wonderful creature. I'm very fond of these. They fly with all the skill and elegance of a well-hefted brick. There's a bee, bumblebee. There's a millipede, a woodlouse. They're really remarkable creatures when you see them up close. They're crustacean, of course, rather than insects. An ant, an ichneumon wasp, a hoverfly, again, a very useful creature in the garden. Holly blue butterfly, which are probably more common in gardens than they are anywhere else in Britain. And here's one, the garden tiger moth, which I do remember from when I was small, but these have become really rare where I live in the sort of Oxfordshire area. And the fact is they don't like the relatively warm winters that we've been having. And actually, as a species, they're gradually migrating north, and they're found further north now than they used to be. And here is a ladybird. I love this picture. It's sat on the edge of the leaf, and you're thinking, is it going to jump? Is it going to fly? Well, I don't know. So these are the invertebrates. There's that lovely quote, the little things that run the world, and they are really interesting and fascinating in their own right. But if you really are a dyed-in-the-mud vertebrate-loving person, you have to remember that they're the food for everything else in the garden. And here's a pair of blue tits with a nice clutch of youngsters. This is an amazing statistic. It's estimated that blue tit chicks need to eat 35 billion caterpillars in Britain every year in order to grow up and to become adults. That's an astonishing amount of caterpillars. So if you garden in such a way that you kill off anything that's possibly eating any of your plants, then effectively you're starving the blue tits as well. So how do gardens compare with other habitats? Here's a surprising statistic. In plant species alone, they contain more per unit area than the African rainforest. That's quite remarkable. Of course, it is true that the African rainforest includes some trees, some of which are so huge they would barely fit into an average British garden. But British gardens have enormous diversity. The garden habitat contains between about 5% and 40% of all of the groups of animal species in Britain. And really there is no other habitat type which is as diverse as gardens. So this is the quick question. Why do you think gardens are so incomparably more diverse than other habitats? Anybody got any suggestions? Unmute if you wish.
We brought in lots of species.
Say again, please. Sorry.
I suppose because they're such small areas, we try to pack as much into them as possible, perhaps.
Yes, I think you're definitely onto something. This is what I call contrived plant diversity. It's definitely a factor. The fact that they're small areas means, of course, that the habitats you have got are very close together and can interact. Any other suggestions?
Yes, possibly the variety of plants and things in the garden that attracts different species.
Yes, I think this comes back to the contrived plant diversity point that we've just spotted. But yeah, I think this is a very major factor, but there are others. The truth is there isn't one single factor. There's a lot of things which combine together. So perhaps to put you out of your misery, let's have a look at some of them. And we were on contrived plant diversity. We all like to go to the garden centre for a nice cup of tea. And as we go in, we see a plant that we really like, so we buy it. And then we move plants around, find a space for it. And then, of course, next week and the week after, we go back and do the same. So as somebody said, we cram an awful lot of different plant species within one small area. And that's going to be very important. The next factor is permanent succession. It's interesting, we were talking a little bit about rewilding earlier, and this is relevant to this particular discussion. Succession, as many of you know, is an ecological term that describes the fact that no habitat ever stays the same, that if you disturb it, it will gradually change back to another condition. And the best way to illustrate this is with a simple graph. And what we've got is a number of species that you record against time. And we're starting off with literally bare ground, and so no species. Then we go through a phase where there's rapid colonization of a lot of species coming in and starting to occupy the spot. It gets to a point, though, where the more fast-growing, larger species, the brambles and brackens of this world, start to outgrow and outcompete the other species. And you then go into a period in which the biodiversity actually declines within the habitat until you get down to what's called a climax situation, where there are actually really probably quite a small number of species and a lot of dominance by particular members. And I kind of illustrated this with what might happen if you left your garden untended, and certainly what you'll end up with then would be probably a lot of brambles and nettles. But the crucial thing here is that you don't let that happen. Gardeners keep the habitat disturbed and hold back succession. If you've got lots of nettles springing up or brambles appearing everywhere, you take them out. And if a plant starts to outgrow what its allocated space, you'll manage it. And so actually gardeners have a very profound effect on holding back succession and disturbing the habitat and making sure that there's space for a lot of different species to operate. So that's another factor. Then there's the variety of structure that we have in gardens. If you think of most habitats, they've pretty much got one sort of structure. Think of a chalk grassland meadow, that's pretty flat. Think of a coppice woodland. It's basically trees and understory and then the base. But a garden has got everything. You've got large trees, medium trees, you've got shrubs, bushes, you've got perennials and beds of annuals, and you've also got things like vegetable patches as well. So there's a huge physical variety of structure. And it's interesting that if you look, for example, at grassland ecology, you'll find a small number of spiders living within a field which has got uniform grass height. But once the grass starts to get tussocky, in other words, the species don't change, but the structure changes, then you find many more species of spiders start to occupy the space. Another factor, surprisingly, is domestic lawns. You may think that there's not much living in your lawn, but work done in Sheffield, which I'll be quoting later, shows anything up to 70 or 80 species can be present in a small number of lawns. So the domestic lawn is actually quite a biodiverse place. Then there's such a lot of plant material there. There's a tremendous food supply that you've crammed into that small space. I mean, some of it is food for us as well, but of course you can expect wildlife to take their tithes from it. So there's a lot of different food webs operating within gardens as well. And this must be another reason why they're so diverse. Another reason is that you actually reproduce some relatively standard British habitats within your garden. If you're lucky enough to have mature trees, either in your garden or close to them, then that's mimicking woodland or deadwood habitat. And don't forget that actually there's more lives in deadwood than necessarily lives on live wood. Shrubs and hedges are a pretty good analogue for the woodland edge, the woodland margin, and perhaps a scrub habitat. It's very interesting that if you look at the overall biodiversity, the biodiversity on the interface between two habitats, like a field and woodland, is actually higher than it is in either of those two habitats on their own. And shrubs and hedges are a great example of woodland margin habitat in the garden. Lawns I've already mentioned, they are effectively a mimic of a grazed meadow. And actually many garden lawns, unless you're really obsessive about managing them, are probably a lot more diverse than most modern grazed meadows, which have had most of the non-ryegrass species removed and which are fertilized to extinction. Your veggie patch and borders is an extremely good mimic for an arable field or a disturbed ground habitat. And many of you probably know that there's a whole group of archaeophytes or ancient visitors to Britain, non-native species that arrived before 1500, many of which are actually cornfield annual species that came over, believe it or not, with the first Neolithic settlers. These are all species which started off in the Near East and came across with people. And although you won't necessarily get all of those in your garden, this arable field imitating habitat is a really special place for specialists that grow up, reproduce within one season, die but leave their seeds on the ground. And as soon as that becomes covered over with other vegetation, these plants will be excluded. A typical garden pond we now know is as good as most country ponds. In fact, a really good garden pond is better than most countryside ponds, which are increasingly suffering from disturbance and pollution now. And your compost heap, I love compost heaps, is a very good analogue for what goes on a forest floor, all the creatures which exist down there in the base of the trees. And finally, the rockery, a very old-fashioned garden habitat, is a good analogue of the sort of conditions you get on sand dunes, rubble, scree, or mountain habitats. And of course, many of you know that rockeries are excellent places for insects to bask and get warm, and they're very good places for overwintering habitat for things like amphibia. But you might question whether gardens actually amount to a significant quantity of habitat. They may be jolly good, but they're all really quite small. But the thing is, gardens add up together. And the total area of gardens in England, sorry we don't have the figure for Wales here, is 500,000 hectares, or around 1/3 million acres. That is actually, to give a Welsh analogue, 1/5 the area of Wales. So it's a heck of a large area. And this map plots out the distribution of suburban garden habitats within Britain. And you'll see that it actually follows communication routes. And the interesting thing is that gardens adjacent to each other provide connectivity throughout now a very fractured countryside, where a lot of the arable and meadow habitats are really not very friendly to wildlife anymore. And gardens will prove quite important with climate change in helping species leapfrog from one stepping stone to another as they migrate through the countryside. Gardens are now the main habitat for some species. There's Welsh groundsel there, stag beetles, which are not doing very well outside gardens, but provided there's deadwood habitat, are doing pretty well in sort of leafy suburbs of cities. There's the house martin and the house sparrow. I think the word house is a very good clue. These are both species which have adapted to live very comfortably adjacent to human habitation. Frogs, apparently now up to 70% of British frogs are now found in gardens, again, because the countryside as a whole, particularly through release of nitrates into freshwater habitats, has become much less attractive. And frogs are doing pretty well in gardens. Here's another thought. Some creatures don't actually necessarily live in your garden, but they will come and visit it because it's a food source. So things like starlings probably won't be nesting in your garden. Muntjac will come and visit and strip everything if they get half a chance. Blue tits may well nest in your garden, but there again, they may be nesting in your neighbour's garden and only coming into yours to look for caterpillars. And of course, things like sparrowhawks rarely nest in gardens, but will come in to feed because of the amount of prey that they can find there. So let's just summarize this a little bit. This is a sort of the scientific background. Gardens are important because lots of species live in them. Lots of additional species make use of them. They are generally much more friendly places for wildlife than typical farmland or plantations. They mount to a very big resource. And one of the nice things is that you as a gardener are in a position where you can maybe think globally about biodiversity, but act locally. And being a wildlife gardener is a heck of a good way of acting locally for wildlife. Okay, so just a little bit, very briefly, about the organisation that I'm involved with. This is the Wildlife Gardening Forum. We were originally founded by English Nature as a project. This was in the days when English Nature actually had some money to do things that it wanted to do. And by 2007, we got a little group together which produced a manifesto, which we still use and which is up on our website. But unfortunately, funding for English Nature was substantially slashed and has continued to be cut since then. So by 2010, the only way we would survive was by setting ourselves up independently as a charity. By 2014, we started work on our website. And as of 2020, with our Facebook and Twitter groups, we've got membership of over 40,000 in our Facebook group. And we've got 2,600 people who are email members of the forum. And we're growing pretty quickly as of 2021. And we've just started a new project based in Leicester, as it happens, working with Learning Through Landscapes, giving us expertise in working within schools and local communities. So that's going to be quite interesting. It's also free to join. There's no membership fees. And so if you're interested and would like to receive our newsletters or get invitation to conferences and so forth, please do just join up and we'd be delighted to greet you. So why do we feel we have to exist? Well, to be quite honest, part of the reason is just to do what I could call preaching the good news about gardens and biodiversity. But actually, there's quite a few things that are rather more worrying than that. So threats to garden wildlife. There's quite a few of these, and I'll go through these essentially one by one, of which the first is ignorance by ecologists. Hopefully, we're beginning to cure this one now, but when we started 10 years ago, this was a big issue. You see, the fact is that gardens will never support the really specialist rare creatures like the swallowtail butterfly or the purple emperor. Well, maybe if you're the Duke of Westminster, you might have purple emperors in your garden, but ordinary human beings won't. Here again, an otter. Most gardens won't have otters in. An avocet. You may have noticed that some of these are iconic species which are used as badges by various biodiversity charities. And because gardens don't hold some of these iconic rarities, some hardline people think that gardens are not relevant to conservation. And I have actually had the the chief executive of quite a significant biodiversity charity, say, any advice other than turning gardens into native plant sanctuaries for rare insects is dishonest. Well, I don't think that's entirely the case. You see, the trouble is that UK conservation, unlike some other countries, has always focused more on rare species than in maintaining overall ecosystem function. We've put a lot of effort into preserving flagship rare species, which would be a shame if we lost them, but it wouldn't make a toss of difference to ecosystem function. So things like the lady slipper orchid in Britain. This is really common on the continent of Europe, but it exists in 1 or 2 habitats only in Britain, where it's protected by around-the-clock volunteer vigilantes who stop them from being dug up. There's the large blue butterfly, which went extinct in Britain largely through the efforts of ecologists who thought they knew better than the insect did what it needed. And we spent a fortune on reintroducing continental stock to try to bring it back, with some success. But the same thing happened to the large copper butterfly, and despite all the best efforts, nothing has managed to bring that back. But perhaps the best example of all is the osprey, which is a tremendous bird. It became very close to extinction, but a massive effort by bird charities, again with round-the-clock surveillance, has managed to bring the osprey back, but at the cost of an enormous amount of money. At the same time, really important species have declined appallingly, and we can mention frogs. We can mention toads, which have hugely declined. Hedgehogs, a nice iconic species, but one which has declined perilously across Britain, but happens to be doing slightly better in gardens than elsewhere. And here, the last example, the wall butterfly, which was common when I was a kid, but has become extremely scarce in the southern parts of Britain. I originally used the example of the small tortoiseshell butterfly here, because that collapsed for reasons nobody terribly well understood. It then came back again, but I gather it's again collapsing. So perhaps I'll have to replace that wall butterfly with a small tortoiseshell. In the meantime, of course, the habitats have declined appallingly. And the worst example is unimproved neutral grassland, of which we've lost all but 2% since World War II. It's all been turned into good farming ground, or else it's been built on. And I think I'd sum this up by saying that we have been a nation of conservation stamp collectors. We, and by that I mean ecologists and planners and conservationists, have been very much more interested in heroic last-ditch preservation of oddities than actually the everyday species which really count. And I think genuinely this is something which is changing now, but it has been a major problem until recently. Well, another thing people say, gardens aren't real habitats. They're obviously artificial, and they're recent, and there hasn't been time for creatures to adapt to them. Not like, of course, the English countryside. And there's a fairly well chosen picture there to illustrate it, with bright green grass everywhere, heavily fertilized grass with very little biodiversity. But the fact is, gardens have been evolving with wildlife for 12,000 years, literally since the end of the last ice age. And the first gardens were created within the Natufian culture, which is sort of proto-Neolithic culture in the Near East. And this is 4,000 years longer than Britain has been an island and capable of evolving its own natural habitats with its own native species. More significantly than that, it's 10,000 years longer than human-managed semi-natural habitats have been going, things like chalk grassland and coppice woodland, which we preserve today as examples of high biodiversity, but which are entirely dependent on the way these habitats have been managed since, roughly speaking, the Iron Age period. And in fact, if you look back in history, we can find some lovely examples of gardens a long time ago. This is the Villa of Livia in Prima Porta in Italy. And Livia was the rather dodgy wife of Caesar Augustus. And she created this wonderful villa. And in a basement underground room there there is an astonishing fresco which shows a desirable Roman garden. And when you look at it, it's got the same things in it that a modern garden would have, with statuary and trees and fruits and so forth, but it's also full of birds. And there are little vignettes around the outer part of the fresco. And here's one with a swallow flying over quince. Here's a golden oriole on pomegranate. And there's the blackbird. So not only were people enjoying gardens at that point, they actually enjoyed the biodiversity, or at least let's say the birds in the garden at that point. So the garden habitat, let's summarize, is ancient. It's highly biodiverse and it's highly significant in areas. So people must stop ignoring it. The next bit I wanted to talk about was myth information, because there have been a lot of myths perpetrated, particularly within some of the cheaper books on wildlife gardening. And perhaps the first one, well, no, let me start off by saying that the reason we can now talk about many of these things as myths is because of work done at Sheffield University by people like Ken Thompson. They worked on the Biodiversity in Urban Gardens project, which was the first serious scientific attempt to do ecological studies within a variety of typical randomly chosen urban gardens. And I can't fail to recommend Ken's wonderful book, No Nettles Required, which summarizes what they found in the Bugs project. And it's an extremely good and quick read. He's a very, very good writer, and I do recommend it. No Nettles Required. So here are some of the myths. Only big suburban gardens are of value. Well, interestingly, the Bugs project found that species richness was pretty much independent of the size of the garden. And of course, for most of the invertebrates we're talking about, even the smallest garden must seem enormous. But it's also a fact that each garden adjoins another. So your garden may be really small, but it adds in with all the ones around to make a very significant amount of area. Another thing is that no groups were more common in the suburbs than they were in the central part of the city. And again, most invertebrates are residents and distance doesn't particularly matter, and most of them can disperse pretty well anyway. In fact, you might suggest that it's an advantage to be in the middle of the town, because then you are less likely to be troubled by rabbits, badgers and deer, which if you do live in the suburbs adjacent to the countryside, you may well get as visitors. This perhaps is the biggest myth of all, and that is you must only plant native species. Now, on the face of it, this makes sense, because obviously the species of animals which live in Britain are adapted to feeding on the plants that live in Britain too. And that means, until quite recently, they would have been adapted to our native species. And this myth has been perpetrated in book after book, and it's largely based on an assumption. The fact is, though, that Bugs looked hard at this, and they found no correlation at all between animal species diversity and the proportion of native species of plants within gardens. And this perhaps seems something of a surprise. But when you actually think harder about it, let's look at the ways in which insects and plants interact. We've got shelter, the provision of pollen and nectar for pollinators, leaves for caterpillars and other bugs to munch, and dead material for detritivores to live in and to feed on. Now, do these need native species? For shelter, no, you don't. It's a question of structure. For pollinators, no. Although some pollinators, some bumblebees are adapted to one particular style of plant, both the native and non-native garden species are perfectly good for providing pollen and nectar for our pollinators. In fact, in some cases, the introduced horticultural species, which tend to produce more flowers and flower for longer, are actually better. Leaves for caterpillars. Now, this one's interesting because there's no question but that some caterpillars are very fussy about the species they feed on. And while, for example, the majority of, or a very high proportion of moths will eat almost anything, butterflies are actually very particular to the species. And in many cases, our native butterflies do require essentially native plants to feed on. So that is a different matter. And finally, the question of dead material for detritivores, no, there's no reason to believe that native species are necessary. And in fact, this whole question spawned a major investigation started by the Wildlife Gardening Forum with the RHS, looking into experimental verification. This was the Plants for Bugs study, which was conducted at Wisley and has now produced, I think, 5 scientific papers, which have clearly pointed out that while native species are good for wildlife, the non-native equivalents that we like to plant in our gardens are also good for wildlife. And as I said before, some of them are actually better in many cases than the natives. So anyway, that's a myth. Here's another one. Wildlife gardens must contain nettles for breeding butterflies. This is because a few species of vanessids, the red admiral, the peacock in particular, and the smallest tortoiseshell, like to feed on nettles as larvae. So bugs looked into this. So they put nettle tubs into a number of gardens in Sheffield, and they looked carefully to see how these nettle tubs were being used. And interestingly, no butterflies used any of the tubs of nettles that had been provided over the whole duration of the bugs project. And the fact is that when you look at the use of nettles by these insects, they tend to be very keen on laying their eggs within very large patches of nettles in full daylight. And if you've just got a little bit of nettles tucked away in your garden, they're actually not very likely to find them and use them. And the thing to remember is that nettles are really appallingly abundant everywhere and will be in your garden too if you don't remove them. And you don't need to plant nettles unless you really like them, in which case I would offer the fact that you're possibly bonkers if you really like nettles. But there we are. So no nettles required, gave him the name for the book. Here's another myth. You must buy special homes for garden animals. And of course, this myth is definitely perpetrated by garden centres and people who make things like garden houses. Bugs tested this by putting bumblebee boxes in their experimental gardens. And over the entire period, not a single bumblebee box had been used ever by any bumblebees. And in fact, they were so surprised at this that in the second year, they actually put older bumblebee nests within the boxes to try to make the boxes smell more appealing. Still no action. And the only association they did find was at the very end of the project, when they picked up the bumblebee boxes, they found one bumblebee had nested underneath a bumblebee box. Now, it is worth making solitary bee nests, such as the one you see there on the left, but actually the best way to make these is to cut up bits of bamboo or to drill holes of various diameters into a piece of wood on your own. Bird nesting boxes are good if they're properly sited and you don't put too many in so that you end up trying to cram too many territories into one small space. But the one that really irritates me is companies that try to make you buy a dormouse box. And the thought that you might get dormice in a dormouse box just if you put a box up is appalling. And I worry that sometimes a doting grandparent might buy one of these for a grandchild who will then be quite convinced that wildlife gardening is a nonsense. Because the fact is, unless you live immediately adjacent to one of those rare colonies of dormice that are in Britain, it's just no point at all. Here's another myth, that lawns should be replaced with wildflower meadows. Well, we do know that quite a lot of species live in lawns anyway, but replacing a lawn with a true wildflower meadow is extremely difficult because lawns are far too fertile and the grasses will dominate and crowd out the species of plants that you put in. There are ways around this though, and you can make a big effort by letting patches of your lawn grow longer and putting in things like bulbs, or if you've got a bit of lawn that you really want to work on, sow yellow rattle, which is hemiparasitic on grass and will weaken it, which gives a chance for the other things to grow through. Another thing you can try is simply taking the lawn up and sowing a cornfield mix with these wonderful arable weeds in it, which will come up as a beautiful temporary structure which will last through the summer, and then you can repeat it again next year. And it's actually a very good thing to do if you're starting a new bed and you're putting in lots of little perennials. Then in the meantime, you can fill the bed up beautifully with cornfield mixes that won't crowd out the perennials you put in. Here's another myth. Magpies and pussycats kill off all the garden birds. Well, certainly some cats will kill huge numbers of birds, but magpies in fact have a perfectly normal predator-prey relationship with songbirds. So if they were to reduce the number of songbirds, they will move away so that they can find another source of food. Cats, on the other hand, it's a bit of a different matter. There are lots of them. There's typically about 200 cats per square kilometre, as opposed to 10 foxes, which are roughly comparable sized predators. And cats hunt for fun. And a lot of research has been done on this, particularly at the University of Reading, and I'm going to quote some of their results. And one thing they did find is that most cats don't really catch that many prey, but there are some old scraggy toms in the street which will catch several hundred prey items in a year. And they obviously are pretty bad for wildlife. The average, though, is only about 19 prey items brought back per year. Now, what effect does this have actually on the birds, let's say? Sorry, I'm going to have a quick drink of water. This graph shows 5 different species of common garden bird, and the study looked at corpses brought in by cats and corpses collected where they'd flown into a window. And the really striking thing is that when they measured the mass of the flight muscles, which is a good indicator of the physical condition that the birds are in every case, those killed by cats had very low muscle mass indices compared to those which we assume are a random sample of those who were killed flying into windows. So it would appear that cats mainly take poor quality birds, perhaps young immature birds or badly fed birds that almost certainly wouldn't survive the next winter anyway. And so it's actually quite doubtful that pussycats do actually limit populations of songbirds. It may be more complicated than that. There are interactions between other corvids and cats, and the story is not completely clear. But I think we can say that cats are nothing like as bad for wildlife as they've been made out to be. Here's another myth. It's always good and important to feed birds in your garden. Yes, feeding can be very helpful, particularly in bad winters, but new diseases have appeared within garden birds, and the first one to appear was trichomoniasis, which is a protozoan parasite found in finches, particularly greenfinch, but now increasingly in other finches as well. And this parasite is debilitating and actually will eventually kill the birds. And the really interesting thing here is looking at BTO data. This shows the numbers of greenfinch recorded on average years. And from 1995 to 2006, it was pretty much the same, constant numbers, going up in the summer, spring and summer, going down in the winter. And then it started to decline from 2007, which was when the disease first appeared. And this decline has continued. This now goes up to 2020 practically. And that early decline, which we noted in the graph there, has gone right down. So there's now a quarter of the number of birds that there were initially. And that is a massive, massive drop. The same thing is true of grape tits. We've got avian pox, which tends not to kill the birds, but it thoroughly weakens them and it's very disfiguring. and it's not doing them any good at all. And that's how it was in 2008. It had just appeared in the south coast of Britain. There it was in 2010, and that's where it is now. So it's pretty much everywhere, but it's still not got beyond a line between the Humber and the Mersey. It may be it's limited by climate beyond that point. And the fact is that this is carried, the problem has arisen because birds come to feeders, an infected bird will wipe its beak, the next bird that comes along will pick up the spores or the protozoans from the parasites and pass them on. So if you do have bird feeders, and let's face it, most of us do, it's really important that you keep them clean. And I always advise you never to put very much bird food into a feeder so that it gets itself emptied really quite quickly, which is a good thing for the birds anyway, because it means it's fresh. And then when it's empty, you always clean the feeder before you put it back out again. And that way, hopefully your feeders will be positive rather than actually, as they are at present, often negative for birds. Here's another issue: increasing amount of concrete paving and decking, particularly in front gardens in city areas for parking. And it's pretty obvious that a concrete paved area is not going to offer very much. And there are these wretched, quick and trendy surfaces which have been created all over, particularly with the help of television pundits. I'm sure many of you remember Ground Force. I've always thought it would be fun to go back to gardens that Ground Force had buggered about with and actually turn them back into something which might be quite nice for wildlife. So I think my message for Alan Titchmarsh is Alan Titchmarsh must be exterminated. We just don't want this sort of thing going on in gardens. And this can extend to complete garden loss. This is a rather sad set of pictures. This shows a typical suburban situation, very similar to where I grew up. And that's at the beginning. This is when all of those houses have been demolished, and you can see something of the huge amount of greenery that was there in the gardens. And that's what's been replaced. Now, we do need houses for people to live in, but that offers almost nothing for wildlife, just a little bit of heavily shaded, rather boring grass around the outside. And it's interesting how the size and extent of gardens has changed with time as well. This is Cholsey near Oxford, where I live. And in fact, that's my garden there on the bottom right. And what you can see is that this sort of Victorian housing density is quite light, and there's big gardens and they're very nicely interconnected. And there's not much in the way of roads in between. New housing, this is Didcot, which is only a few miles down the road from me. And you'll see how tiny the gardens are, and that they're all set out by these roads. So there's tremendous barriers between movement and dispersion between them. And these are really not going to offer the same opportunities for wildlife as the older, larger gardens would do. Something else that's a bit of a worry is excessive chemical use. For various reasons, we don't simply advocate organic gardening, if only because actually quite a high proportion of gardeners really don't want to go entirely down that route. But what we do ask people to do is to try not to use stuff which is, after all, designed to kill wildlife. I just don't use I don't use insecticides at all in the garden, and I've never found any reason for doing so. I do make some use of herbicides with very problematic species like things like ground elder, for example, which will grow amongst other plants' roots. But I have to say, even ground elder is quite a nice plant, and there might be an argument to be said for me not taking it out at all and just letting it go. Here's another interesting thing. Climate change effects are coming visible now in gardens, and will have a profound effect over the next 50 odd years. Bud break in horse chestnuts is 12 days earlier than it is in the 1980s. Frog spawn is at least a month earlier most years, and in the southwest of Britain now, it's actually found before Christmas. The comma butterfly, which used to be confined to southern England, is now breeding as far north as Scotland. This has been one of the winners with climate change, and it's migrated a long way north. Gardens will help wildlife adapt to climate change. They can act as stepping stones for migrating species, as we've seen before, because the garden habitat has very high connectivity. It's also interesting that every garden comes with a reserve manager, so people can manage garden habitats much easier than people can manage countryside habitats. And they can even create new garden habitats or modify their garden habitat as climate change continues and provide new food sources for some of the new species which are likely to start coming in. So, what does science tell us really helps garden wildlife? Having trees and large shrubs, having a variety of habitats, having a really good variety of plants. Special habitats like ponds, log piles, compost heaps are really disproportionately valuable if you can include them. Hedges and walls are very good for wildlife. Try to avoid hard surfacing, and please don't be too obsessively tidy, removing things like seed heads before the animals had been able to eat them. And please be easy on the chemicals. In gardens where people do that, have more species of invertebrates. Well, thanks very much for listening. That's more or less all I would want to say. Other talks I have will follow this up with, for example, practical wildlife gardening and things like gardening for ponds, as well as introducing some of the creatures you find. I'd just like to mention our website, Wildlife Gardening Forum website at wlgf.org. And because I've been talking a bit about myths, there is a set of pages on the website about wildlife gardening myths, and that's the first one which leads you in. So basically, that's me finished. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might wish to throw at me.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. We've all learned a lot about our gardens, and I think we're justifiably bonkers over here, Jill and myself. We love our nettles.
No, well, no, not entirely
Not
true.
inside.
No, I have noticed that nettles growing in a shady spot, quite sheltered, have got a lot of obviously moth caterpillars on at the moment. They've been eaten a lot, and they've actually got little webbings in the growing tip.
Yeah.
And I think quite a lot of moths do use them, micro moths probably.
Yes, yeah.
I think there's a lot of insects that use nettles actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are. The new section of my website, the section on garden plants, has a whole section on what I'm calling gate crashers. And we have profiles of a number of what one might call weed species there, including nettles. Mm-hmm. And while you don't have to grow nettles in your garden, should you choose to do so and let them thrive in a corner, there are actually a lot of species that do eat them, but not particularly important for the butterflies, which everybody says is why you have to grow nettles.
You're quite right.
Thankfully, we've got quite a lot of space. We can kind of have quite large clumps in sunshine, small gardens. I can see exactly what you're saying. That's sometimes.
The thing is that nettles are very common in the countryside still, so that's one thing that
yes, and extremely common in the suburban habitat as well, on any little bit of waste ground, and there's always bits of that around. So at this stage, while if you want to grow nettles, fine, you don't need to feel that if you don't grow nettles, you won't get butterflies, because you will. Well, you get those.
Right. If anybody wants to kind of show their faces on video and maybe ask a question, Jill's looking out for people who might be putting their hands up. If you want to put your hand up virtually, by all means do so. If you've got a question in the chat, I'll put that to Steve.
Susan and Horace on Anglesey have actually got their hands up.
Yes, I see that.
Right.
Hi.
Want to unmute yourselves and show yourselves?
Right, okay. we used to have a very healthy population of frogs every year in the pond. The grass snakes arrived and all the frogs have disappeared. And we're worried now, the grass snakes have gone and now the toad population is disappearing.
Interesting. Grass snakes do eat frogs, but they do eat a lot of other things as well. Generally, when people tell me they've lost their frogs and I ask what else they've got in the pond, it turns out that they've got a lot of newts. And surprisingly, do you have newts in your pond?
No, no newts at all.
Or well, you see, in which case this doesn't apply. But for just generally, I will say that newts are surprisingly very effective at eliminating frogs from a pond. Not that they fight with the adult frogs, but they eat the frog spawn. They can literally suck the little black embryos out of frog spawn. And when I put my pond in the garden, I had a wonderful number of frogs. And gradually the newt population has built up such that I simply can't get frog spawn. Well, first of all, no frog spawn is ever laid in my pond anymore. And secondly, if I put some in, which I know you're not really supposed to do, the newts still polish off the embryos. But in your case, it's very interesting. Are you living in isolation, or are there other houses and ponds and so on nearby?
I would say there's no other ponds nearby.
Well, there is. Here there is.
Or few, very few ponds.
There are
Yeah.
few.
And are you seeing any frogs in the garden?
None at all.
No. Well, it does sound like it's a possibility that grass snakes have taken them, but frogs and newts are quite mobile. I mean, newts will migrate as much as half a kilometre regularly to go backwards and forwards to their natal ponds. And if there are frogs in the area and no other predators, then I would have expected them to come back. And it may be that they will come back. But the usual explanation of competition with newts certainly doesn't seem to apply in your case. So I don't think I can offer another explanation. I wonder if anybody else can. Anna, I see you there looking in.
Can I say that the grass snakes have now disappeared? Now the frogs have gone.
She said the grass snake's gone, yeah.
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 Well, in which case maybe they'll come back. But I really wouldn't like to say. I have to say I'm very envious that you've got grass snakes. I don't have grass snakes. I wish I did. I've once seen a slow worm in the garden, which staggered me because I didn't really think we had any. And down the road, a colleague has actually got lizards in his garden.
Wow.
And he swears they found their own way in there, but I don't believe him. It could be that your frogs will come back. Anna.
Well, yes, I think it's very difficult with, as you say, many people say, I used to have frogs and then I don't have them. And then why? And it can be also things like runoff, chemicals, or anything else that might have come into your pond, which you don't necessarily are in control of, depending on where you live. But I also find, I'll say, depend on the size of pond. So I got a big pond, 8 meters by maybe 4 meters. And this year, I knew there were always newts in it, but this year I have had literally hundreds of frogs in there and toads. And I did a little film, which I think Mark put on YouTube. It was like, I find it highly entertaining. I walked around my pond and everywhere there were frogs and toads hiding.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Now, if you look at it now, you see the surface of the water and it's just moving. And that is just tadpoles. It's just a seething mass of tadpoles.
Oh, I'm jealous, Anna. That's ridiculous. It is unusual to get all three major species in the same pond. I mean, toads in particular generally like big ponds. And although yours is large, it's about the same size as mine. And
Okay,
we use even bigger ponds than that.
Yeah, no, I'll show you. I'll put up. We can put up some more of those. I got little films of the toads mating, and then also because when we emptied the pond a couple of years ago to do some clearance, one of my son's friends, he was counting all the newts, putting them in a special bucket, and we had 67 newts in that pond. Like, wow.
Let's break it. Juliet's asking a related kind of question here. She's saying she's heard that you shouldn't move frog spawn into your garden pond. Could this be a problem?
Yes. Now, I did say I put some frog spawn in my garden. It was from my next door neighbour, about 60 feet away from my pond, and there would be complete interchange of frog stock between those gardens. The reason you're told not to do it is because there are very unpleasant diseases which are affecting frogs. There's one called red leg disease, for example, which is, it's a very odd sort of fungus, and it causes very considerable mortality, and it's very, very disturbing because the frogs clearly are suffering badly when they get it. And there's a general requirement or suggestion, try to avoid moving either frogs or frog spawn around the country, because you may inadvertently be moving this disease with it. And so this is certainly something I would not advise you to do, except if you are doing it on such a small scale as, for example, in my case, from literally next door, where you know that the frogs are healthy. But no, you're quite right. It's not something to do, generally speaking, and certainly not moving things any large distance.
Fair enough. Okay, that's good. There's another related pond question here before. There's another one before. Our pond has a lot of slime in it. Should we fish it out? A lot of slime.
Well, do you like it? Are you fond of slime? If you are, then I would strongly suggest you leave it in there. If it's worrying you, it would be interesting to find out what the slime is. Is it green slime?
Yes, it is. Yes. I don't know if you can hear me okay.
It's probably, is it blanket weed, which is a really slimy, sludgy, bubbly stuff that you get in ponds. Blanket weed is perfectly natural and normal. Yeah, it's natural, it's normal, it's ugly. It's not bad for the creatures in the pond. In fact, it's actually quite good habitat for some of them. But ponds are rather like gardens. What you want is to have plenty of a variety of habitat. If the whole of the top of your pond gets covered with blanket weed, it actually isn't very good, because it's preventing things from living in other parts of the pond or other types of habitat. So what I do is, yes, I do fish it out. And it's interesting that it tends to be present early in the year, because as the water warms up and the sunlight builds up, then the nutrients which have been accumulating in the water over the winter with things rotting at the bottom get picked up by the algae. And you get this great bloom of filamentous algae living in the pond. And yes, I tend to take it out. Later in the summer, particularly when some of the pond surface has been shaded out by things like water lilies, it tends not to be so much of a problem. It's also, if you're continually filling your pond up with tap water, that's another thing which can cause a lot of problems with weed algae. And that's because tap water in most parts of the country has been adulterated with phosphorus, with phosphates, in order to ensure that you're not picking up any lead in your water supply, because there is still sufficient old lead in particularly older parts of Britain that it will be picked up by you. And there's a lead directive which originated in the EU, which limits the amount of lead that can be found in tap water coming out of the tap. And that's why, because the water companies have no control over what happens between their main and your tap, they have to add phosphorus. And phosphorus is, as you know, an extremely important plant nutrient. And unlike nitrates, which can be denitrified, once it gets in the pond, it stays there. And so if you habitually fill up your pond with tap water, then you're going to get an increasing problem with blanket weed.
Okay.
Thank you very much. No, we don't need to fill it up with tap water. We live in North Wales. Thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, Jan's got a question.
Jan,
Yeah.
and then Peter.
Oh, well, not exactly a question. I was just going to say that I also find that if you get a balance of oxygenating plants in the pond, it seems to balance out whatever the problem is with the equilibrium of the water, and the blanket weed just disappears. But that's maybe because I've got a sort of quarter-acre pond, but it's got loads of other plants and sludge and all kinds of things. But I got blanket weed problem with it when we first made it 20 years ago, but I haven't ever had blanket weed problem since.
No, I think the scale is probably helping. How deep is it, Jan?
It's only about 4 foot deep in the middle.
Which is actually quite deep for a wildlife pond. And if it's big, it may well be that it doesn't get disturbed and a lot of the nutrients literally get trapped down there in the bottom sediment. But what you're saying about oxygenators, actually, can we extend that to just say, have as much plant material in your pond as you can get? I usually say roughly 2/3 in summer, roughly 2/3 of your pond surface really ought to be partly obscured by vegetation, because of course the green plants that you like will be supping up the phosphates and the nutrients just as much as the algae. Thing is that the algae tend to get going earlier in the year, and naturally when things like water lilies and so forth start growing up, then it becomes less of a problem.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, who was next?
Can I just go to the chat because someone's been waiting on the chat? I'll come back to you, Anna. Is that okay? This just Julian and Kay. I don't know whether they want to go on to speak about this, but they're worried about the fact that almost all garden fencing and decking is made of wood treated with chemical preservatives. Is this a problem? Or can be a problem?
Yeah. I'd like to see the data on it. It's very easy to look at something and say, I don't like the way that's done. And I cannot believe for one moment that decking and fencing treated with chemicals is going to be good for wildlife. What we don't know is whether it is actually bad for wildlife, unless experimental studies are done. And it's interesting that if you look at the evidence on things like slug pellets, it's actually very much weaker than many people assume. And the good old-fashioned slug pellets have now been banned again. But actually, if you look at the government evidence that they based this on, it was really putting the precautionary principle to the absolute extreme. And this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to argue much about the use of chemicals within gardens, because nobody has done the work. When in the Wildlife Gardening Forum, we started looking at what the really big questions are in wildlife gardening. We identified two, of which the first one was this question of native or non-native species. The second question we identified was what actual damage do chemicals do in the garden if they're used absolutely sensibly? And the fact is that there has been no research done on this. It would be extremely expensive and difficult to do. Because, for example, if you only only use chemicals, not prophylactically, but in response to a genuine problem, then you're going to have to wait maybe years for that genuine problem to occur so that you then use the chemicals and then can see whether there's any consequent damage happened. But the chances are that it's probably a thing to avoid, but that the actual consequences may be less than most of us assume.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you. Did you have somebody?
Yeah, Ruth, Anna, and
Oh,
Peter.
Ruth,
All had their hands up at one
Ruth,
time.
your hand up, yeah.
Yes, I just, can you let me know how you would clean your bird feeder? Because it always gets a bit sort of gunky at the bottom. So how do you go about cleaning your bird feeder?
I couldn't put it better myself. Gunky is an extremely good way of describing it. I mean, the worst thing is if you overfill it and it gets wet, they're all supposed to self-drain, but they don't. But the seeds start germinating and then they stick together and then they start smelling, and it is revolting.
Right.
So what I use, I bring them in, I take them apart, obviously, and I swill them out with hot water from the tap. And I use bottle brushes or knives or things to remove bits which are trapped and get them as physically clean as I can. And then I use moderately diluted bleach and just give them a quick going over with moderately diluted bleach, and that solves the problem. Nothing will survive that.
Good.
But do rinse them out before you refill them, because I don't think
I think I would do that. Good. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, thank you.
Peter did have his hand up.
Peter,
before,
did you
but I
get your
don't
hand
know
up,
if he's-
Peter? No,
he's
maybe
not
not.
listening.
I've got a few comments in the chat regarding concrete on gardens. One from Miriam: what can we do about paving over front gardens for parking? And Jake says our garden is all concrete, and we rent it, so I can't change it. But besides a few pot plants and a bird feeder, what do you suggest to try to make it better for any wildlife?
Well, I take it that there's no possibility of lifting the concrete because no, I mean, quite often the concrete in the garden isn't actually all that thick. It's a couple of inches. And if you're really feeling heroic, you can actually lift it with a sledgehammer once you get started. I mean, it's going to be a lot of hard work, and there may be all sorts of good reasons why you can't do it. What you can do is to build raised beds on top of concrete. And this is really not that difficult. I mean, classically, you might use things like old sleepers, but just simply using wooden battening of maybe 8 or 10 inches deep and putting topsoil and compost and so on in there, then actually you'll be able to grow an awful lot of stuff, literally physically on top of the concrete. I mean, the simpler way to do it, of course, is to have lots of plants in pots. And I've seen some really inspiring tiny urban gardens where people have concentrated on plants in pots, and they look pretty good. And I assume, and I think they'll probably have quite a lot of wildlife using them anyway. Certainly, if there are plants flowering in there, they'll be bringing in and attracting pollinators. So I think that's probably what I would suggest. Ideally, you get rid of the concrete. Oh yeah, look, Anna's saying to everybody, in her first gardening talk, she showed examples of a garden built on concrete. Yeah, there's no reason why you can't do that. Thank you, Anna. I must look at this talk. She's been trying to get me to watch her talks, and I've been claiming I'm too busy, but I can see I obviously have got to. Yes.
Just a quick. Tina's asking about sea buckthorn plants, trees in a garden plot of land. Well, the birds love the berries.
Well, why ever not? It's not a common thing to see in gardens. I don't honestly know that I've seen sea buckthorn in gardens, but I have a horrible feeling it's one of those things that the Danes used to put in their beer because it made them go berserk. And I remember as an undergraduate going on a field course and finding this stuff and trying to roll it up into a cigarette and finding it was deeply disappointing. But no, I mean, why not? If you can get hold of sea buckthorn, give it a go. It's absolutely not one that I've seen people talking about.
I think we have it on the coast here. I think it's a good sea plant.
Yeah.
Hedges.
People get confused with the buckthorn that we need for the brimstone. The brimstone butterfly can only feed on purging buckthorn.
And I think alder buckthorn doesn't it?
Buckthorn on peaty bogs, on acid soils. And so I'm always trying to get any sort of school or community project I do, I plant at least one purging buckthorn. But they're difficult to get hold of. I've just lost my supplier I normally had. But people get mixed up with sea buckthorn, which is more commonly sold in garden centres because of the orange.
Is it? Yeah.
But it's not,
I mean, it's a very different plant. It's not related at all, is it?
I don't think the brimstone can feed on it. However, in Europe, the brimstone does seem to feed on other kinds of buckthorns that they have on the continent. So I've been hearing just recently.
I must admit, I thought it fed on more than just one sort of buckthorn. I mean, the actual rhamnus, isn't it?
Well, we've always been told it's just the purging or the alder buckthorn in this country.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the alder buckthorn. Well, I put both of those in my garden. They're both very small at this stage, but they're beginning to grow up nicely. So I'm hoping we will get some.
Oh, I've actually had brimstones patrolling my whole hedge of buckthorn, which has been planted for at least 10 years now. Last year and the last 2 years, but I don't seem to have had any eggs laid, frustratingly.
Oh, how frustrating. You've actually raised an interesting point there. This sort of talk can go on forever, but it's all very well for me to say, why not put alder buckthorn into your garden? But actually what we really don't know is how large a plot of any one species of plant you need to have before it's likely to be used by the target insect. And we do know that for the vanessid butterflies, you do need to have a big well-lit patch.
Yeah.
It may be that just putting
they also do know that the brimstone needs a single tree set apart in a sunny spot. And my hedge is so threadbare that it's very much a row of trees set apart in a sunny spot, and the buckthorn can travel up to 15 miles looking for a place to lay its eggs. The thing is, it's very scarce in North Wales, and I think it's just because it wasn't traditionally used, buckthorn, for hedging by farmers.
Could I break in? Could I ask Anna, do you want to ask your question about
collecting again?
Anna, do you want to ask you a question about the planners? I think that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I know, Steve, that the forum is working and trying to be the, well, I don't know exactly how much success you have had, but I know that is what it's up to you, close to your heart, influencing planners to include green spaces. And I see it in my own village now, new developments, and the gardens are titchy, and there's absolutely none of that connecting, bit of green space between. Yeah. So how do we go about it?
Well,
it's so evident during lockdown how people value green space in their gardens.
Exactly, yeah.
But the thing is, it's the builders the developers who spend a huge amount of money on building land, which is kept separate from green belt land, which is actually a sterile desert. And so they want to cram as many houses onto a smaller plot as possible.
I know.
How the legislation for building has to be changed.
Exactly.
Well, I think, to be honest, generally speaking, money goes where consumers want it to go. And if we can actually persuade people, and as you mentioned, the COVID crisis has certainly made a difference here, that actually gardens are not just for biodiversity or football, they're for human health and well-being, then we have a vastly better way of getting at government and planners than if we just want to encourage people to have lots of pretty butterflies, because the government doesn't give a toss about biodiversity. I think it's demonstrated that over the last 50 years extremely effectively. But what it does give a toss about is public health and well-being. And that is, I think, the more profitable way for us to go. Within the forum, we identified right at the beginning that we want to have an impact on planning. We want to get the importance of gardens for people and biodiversity much higher up on the national agenda. We are still really at a stage when we're trying to make ourselves credible, which is why we put such a lot of effort into the website. At present, our organisation is entirely volunteer run, and to be quite honest, a lot of that is me personally. But things are beginning to change. We've got a 1 day a week paid person helping us with this new education project in Leicester. And on the strength of that, I'm planning in the next year, hopefully, to put in a big application to one of the larger trusts to actually give us a couple of project officers full-time who can really start to make a difference on this. To tell the truth, I'm fed up with the way that so many charities run around spending all their time raising money to keep the staff together, many of whom are actually employed to raise money. And so from the outset, the Wildlife Gardening Forum decided we were not going to employ people. We were going to try and do it all through volunteer work. And I think we could do much better using volunteers, but I think the time has come when we may have to try find a way of getting some paid support as well. So yeah, it's a big priority when we're ready to do it.
Yeah, one thing I must add on that, because I think two really important things you raised is this is something we can all do at home, and this is why I have kept going with the Wildlife Gardening Project and raising the money to keep myself in a post for the last 20 years. So it's that message that everybody can make a difference. And especially at the moment when people are feeling really worried about climate change and also about COVID. And so then those two things together has actually showed everybody, including governments, how important the gardens are. And so I just feel like we have so much, we could potentially do so much. So it's just as you say, but I still feel like it's an uphill battle to even keep myself in a post. And the thing that you were saying, still many ecologists, I still feel like they treat you slightly like I'm a little bit of an add-on, extra little bit of, yeah, that's kind of a nice thing to do in your garden. Whereas the ecologists to do it on a nature reserve, so they are the serious people.
Yeah.
Still a little bit of that attitude.
Oh no, there's not a little bit of it. There's a lot of that attitude.
Thank you.
And I mean, wildlife trusts, bless them, have in many cases got people involved in trying to promote wildlife gardening. But to be honest, that's not their real job. Their real job is to get people to join, to pay their money, to help them to manage their nature reserves. And it's just always such a conflict, really. The other thing I would say is that one thing that's happened with COVID is the government has spent and borrowed unbelievable amounts of money, which it is going to, without any doubt, claw back from all of the things we would like it to spend money on in the future. So actually getting money out of government to do anything that's actually worthwhile doing, I suspect is going to be blooming difficult. I shouldn't say this, but I will. Adding Brexit on top of it isn't doing anybody any good.
No.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, on that point, I think maybe we should start thinking about what. Thank you so much, Steve. I think it's a high kind of a high point, or a kind of an optimistic point, maybe, on an enthusiastic point, and maybe we could invite you back for another of your talks, maybe.
Well, if you're prepared to put up with it.
I mean, you said you had other talks there to add like a sequence, like a follow-on kind of talks, maybe.
Yeah, ironically, this tends to be one of a set of 3 talks which introduce the subject of wildlife gardening generally. This is the one which I think is most important for people who are already interested to hear, because it gives some of the foundation and background to it, the science, if you like.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm sure you get, I mean, you've got some very impressive speakers coming. The next 2, I sound really brilliant.
Yeah.
So I do hope you'll all go and listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all I can do is and I'll to everybody out there, I'll send an email with the link to the Wildlife Gardening Forum, which I suggest everybody joins.
Yay!
It is free.
It is free, yes.
It's free, which is got not much in life is free these days. Our talks are free, which is fantastic. Your Wildlife Gardening Forum is free, so I suggest people take advantage of that, really, because it's a mine of information, isn't it? It's a mine of information which you're adding to all the time. You've told me about already.
Yes, we've got a big new section coming up on wildflowers and wild plants in gardens, because these are always neglected on wildlife gardening websites, because people are always interested in what you put in for birds and for insects. The plants tend not to be valued in their own right, so I'm trying to turn that one around.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Well, I'll let you go in a minute, Steve. And thanks everybody for coming. Whilst we've still got 56 people still participating, maybe we could send Steve on his way with a round of applause. If you all want to unmute yourselves, you're allowed to do that.
Thank you, Steve.
You're allowed to do that. Thank you so much. And we will be in touch, I'm sure.
We've had some really good talk, but that is one of the.
It's absolutely fantastic.
Oh, well. Anyway, again, thank you, Mark and Gillian, for twisting my arm over this. It's been a pleasure. It's really nice to catch up with you, Jan, and you, Anna, as well.
Yeah, Mark and Gillian are really active for the Wildlife Trust, and Mark has been doing a sterling job getting all these speakers for us during lockdown.
Yeah, I'm impressed, very impressed.
Yes, they know. I think they're so desperate to speak to somebody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, pair of them. Yeah.
If I close down.
Yes, look. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, everybody, I'm off for a large gin and tonic. Possibly not just one. But anyway, thanks very much for having me. And I wish I could remember how to say farewell and so forth in Welsh. But anyway.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Mark. Maybe see you next time.
Without you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Take
Anna.
care. Cheers, Anna. Bye, Jan.
See you again, a lot of you. Take care.
There we go.